Landing Zone E, 2 miles west of Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, Normandy, somewhere between 0345 and 0400 hours on the 6th of June, 1944. A Waco C G4A glider named the Fighting Falcon, plywood and steel tube and fabric, no engine, no weapons, comes down out of the dark exactly where it is supposed to. At the controls are Lieutenant Colonel Mike Murphy, the senior American glider pilot in the entire European theater, and Second Lieutenant John L. Butler in the co-pilot's seat. Lashed inside the fuselage behind them is a jeep, and sitting in that jeep, already strapped in for the landing, is Brigadier General Don Pratt, Assistant Commander of the 101st Airborne Division. The landing itself goes right. The glider touches down on target, in the dark, moments after being cut loose from its tow plane at roughly 600 feet. Then Murphy applies the brakes, and nothing happens the way it should, because the grass beneath the wheels is wet and freshly cut, and the aircraft simply will not stop, sliding on across the field toward a line of poplar trees some 40 feet tall, planted along the hedgerow at its edge. It hits the trees at speed. Lieutenant Butler is killed instantly, thrown forward into the wreckage. Murphy survives, both legs broken, one of them shattered so badly it will trouble him for the rest of his life. Brigadier General Don Pratt, sitting in the jeep behind them, dies of a broken neck from the whiplash of the impact, becoming the highest-ranking Allied officer killed on D-Day, and one of only 2 American generals killed in action anywhere during the entire Normandy campaign. Pause on that sentence. The highest-ranking American to die on the single most famous day of the Second World War was not killed by a German bullet, a German shell, or a German mine. He was killed by wet grass, 40 feet of ordinary hedgerow trees, and the simple physical fact that the aircraft carrying him had no engine to abort the landing with once the brakes failed to bite in time. This is not a story about one crashed glider in one field in Normandy. This is the story of roughly 6,000 young Americans, most of whom had volunteered for the program only after the regular Army Air Forces had already rejected them for something else, who flew plywood and canvas aircraft with no engine, no armor, no parachute, and not a single mounted gun of any kind into the most heavily defended coastline on Earth, and who then, if they survived the landing, were expected to keep fighting as ordinary infantry riflemen for however long the battle around them lasted. Part 1. The idea that a purpose-built glider force belonged in a modern invasion at all did not originate with the Americans. It traces to a single spectacular demonstration the Allies watched from the outside. On the 10th of May 1940, a small force of German glider infantry rode silent DFS-230 gliders directly onto the roof of the supposedly impregnable Belgian fortress of Eben Emael, cut the fortress's gun cupolas apart with shaped explosive charges, and forced its garrison of roughly 1,200 men to surrender within a single day, at a cost of a handful of German casualties. Allied planners studied that operation closely and drew an obvious lesson. A glider could deliver a fully formed, heavily equipped unit onto one specific patch of ground with a precision no parachute drop could match, and it could do it in near total silence because it carried no engine to give away its approach. The American answer, developed through 1941 and 1942, was the Waco CG4A, built primarily by the Ford Motor Company and by a consortium of furniture and piano manufacturers, including Steinway, alongside the original Waco Aircraft Company of Troy, Ohio, roughly 13,000 of them eventually produced across the war. It was a plywood floor, a welded steel tube fuselage frame, and fabric doped taut over the whole airframe, weighing under 2 tons empty and cleared to carry a fully loaded weight near 7,500 pounds, enough for 13 fully equipped troops, or a jeep, or a 75mm pack howitzer, depending on how its detachable nose section was loaded that day. Crews who flew it, only half in jest, called it the flying coffin, because unlike the men flying every other aircraft this channel has told a story about, the crews of a CG-4A had no engine to nurse them home if anything at all went wrong, and no second attempt at the field waiting below them. The aircraft's reputation for danger did not wait for Normandy to be established. On the 1st of August 1943, a CG-4A on a promotional flight over Lambert Field in St. Louis shed part of its wing structure in midair and crashed in front of a crowd gathered to watch it, killing all 10 people aboard, among them Missouri's sitting lieutenant governor. The accident became national news and briefly threatened the entire glider program's political support before it had flown a single combat mission, a grim preview of the aircraft's underlying fragility that the men training at South Plains that same year understood better than almost anyone outside the program. Part 2. The men who flew this aircraft into combat were, almost without exception, volunteers who had not originally set out to become glider pilots at all. The regular aviation cadet program that trained fighter and bomber pilots enforced medical and educational standards that quietly excluded a great many young men who wanted badly to fly. And the Army Air Forces discovered that its glider program could accept candidates under the considerably less restrictive Class II flying standard, opening the door to men who had already been told somewhere else in the system that they were not good enough. Roughly 6,000 of them trained across a network of bases stretched from Texas to New York, with the great majority receiving their advanced training and their silver glider pilot wings at South Plains Army Airfield outside Lubbock, Texas, a base that would graduate its final class in January 1945 before the entire program wound down. Washout rates in advanced training ran high, by some accounts close to half of every class, because landing a 7,500-pound aircraft with no engine and no second attempt on an unfamiliar field turned out to be an extraordinarily unforgiving skill to certify a man in. Graduates who held no prior military rank were, in the program's earliest form, promoted only to staff sergeant, an enlisted rank for men flying combat missions deep into occupied territory. From the 21st of November 1942 onward, the Army revised the arrangement, appointing newly qualified glider pilots to a rank invented specifically to solve this problem, flight officer, roughly equivalent to a junior grade warrant officer, a rank that existed mainly to answer the awkward question of what to call a man who flew an unarmed combat aircraft into Fortress Europe, but was not, in any traditional sense, a commissioned officer. The training pipeline itself was built in stages precisely because no one, at the start of the war, actually knew how to teach a man to land an unpowered aircraft under combat conditions. A cadet typically began in a light-powered aircraft, an Aeronca or a Piper Cub, simply to confirm basic flying aptitude, before moving into unpowered Schweitzer T-G series training gliders to learn the specific discipline of judging a landing with no engine to correct a bad approach. Only after that did a man reach South Plains Army Airfield for advanced training in the CG-4A itself, practicing tow takeoffs, mid-air releases at varying altitudes, and above all, spot landings, bringing a fully loaded glider down inside a marked and increasingly small target area on the field, over and over, because a combat landing zone in Normandy would not forgive a pilot who floated past his mark by even 100 yards into a hedgerow or a flooded pasture. Night landing practice mattered just as much, since a large share of the actual missions flown into Normandy went in during darkness or at first light, and Texas offered wide, flat, well-mapped fields that bore almost no resemblance to the tight, irregular pastures of the Norman bocage country the same men would be landing in months later. Patchworks of small fields boxed in on every side by earthen banks topped with centuries-old hedgerows thick enough to stop a tank, let alone a gliding aircraft trying to roll to a stop. Part 3. Flying the aircraft itself demanded a specific, entirely unglamorous kind of nerve that had nothing to do with dogfighting. ACG-4A crossed the English Channel at the end of a 300-foot, 1-inch nylon tow rope behind a C-47 Skytrain, flying at roughly 120 to 150 miles an hour, buffeted constantly by the tow plane's prop wash and by ordinary turbulence. The pilot's entire job for most of the flight, simply to hold position on that rope, using a telephone line strung along it to talk to the tow plane's crew. At the moment of release, usually a matter of a few hundred to 1,000 feet above the ground, the glider pilot had to find and land on one specific dark field, chosen weeks earlier from aerial photographs and maps he might never have seen from the air in daylight, and he had exactly one attempt to do it. There was no going around for a second pass. There was no engine to climb away with if the field turned out to be shorter, softer, or more heavily obstructed than briefed. And there was nothing mounted anywhere on the airframe that could shoot back at anything on the ground. Not a machine gun, not a single rifle built into the aircraft itself. A genuinely unusual condition for a combat aircraft on either side of this war. Every other captured or contested airplane this channel has told a story about, the Spitfire, the Thunderbolt, the Mustang, the Lightning, could at least claim to carry guns of its own. The CG-4A could not. Every CG-4A carried 2 men up front for exactly this reason, a pilot and a co-pilot, because the mission profile assumed that either man might be killed or incapacitated by flak or a bad landing before the aircraft ever reached the ground. And the survivor needed to be able to bring 13 passengers down alive regardless. On the Fighting Falcon, that calculation failed in the cruelest possible way. It was the co-pilot who died, and the passenger behind him, not the pilot at the controls. While Murphy himself, the man best qualified in the entire theater to fly that specific glider, lived through the crash that killed the other 2 men sharing it with him. Part 4. The men planning the invasion were, in the weeks beforehand, seriously afraid this combination, no engine, no weapons, one attempt only, would end in catastrophe. Air Chief Marshal Sir Trafford Leigh-Mallory, commanding the Allied Expeditionary Air Force, put his fears in writing directly to General Eisenhower, estimating that airborne and glider troops together might suffer losses as high as 70% once German anti-aircraft fire, night landings, and ground obstacles were all accounted for. And he formally urged that the entire American airborne portion of the invasion, gliders included, be scrapped. Eisenhower weighed the argument for days, aware that if Leigh-Mallory's number was even roughly right, the force meant to secure the ground behind Utah Beach would be gutted before the invasion had properly begun, and the beach landing behind it might follow it into failure. Lieutenant General Louis Brereton and Major General Matthew Ridgway, who would actually command the men making the jump and the landing, argued the opposite case, that the airborne plan was sound and necessary to the whole invasion's success. In the end, it was Field Marshal Montgomery who settled the argument, ruling that the airborne and glider plan would proceed largely as designed. 6,000 young men, who had mostly volunteered because someone, somewhere, had told them they were not good enough to fly anything else, were now going into France on the strength of a general's judgment call, made over the direct written objection of the man commanding the very air force that would be carrying them there. The argument played out over barely a week, in the final days before the invasion could no longer be postponed without losing the narrow window of tide and moonlight the whole plan depended on. Eisenhower later wrote that few decisions in the campaign weighed on him as heavily as the choice to send the airborne forces in against Leigh-Mallory's direct written warning, aware that if the air marshal's number proved even roughly accurate, he would be responsible for having ordered thousands of young men to their deaths in the war's opening hours for no gain at all. He let the plan stand. There was no dramatic reversal, no last-minute compromise. The missions flew essentially as briefed, carrying men who mostly never learned, until long after the war, how close the entire program had come to being canceled outright over their heads. Part 5. The specific defense Leigh-Mallory named in his warning was Rommelspargel, Rommel's asparagus, a set of obstacles Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had personally ordered planted across every inland field in Normandy that looked open and flat enough to receive a glider. More than 1 million wooden poles, most roughly 6 to 12 inches thick and driven several feet into the ground, with several more feet standing above the surface, were set out across the region's pastures through the early months of 1944, many of them strung together with wire and rigged with mines or grenades to detonate on contact. On paper, this was exactly the kind of obstacle that could tear an incoming glider's wings and undercarriage apart before it ever finished its landing roll. In practice, across the specific stretch of Normandy the Americans actually used, the poles caused far less damage than either side had expected, because German defensive planners had guessed the Allied airborne force would land well inland, and had concentrated the heaviest planting there, while Allied planners, aware of roughly that same assumption, deliberately pulled most of their actual landing zones in closer to the beaches than the German engineers had prepared for. The obstacle Leigh-Mallory feared most turned out to be waiting, for the most part, in the wrong fields on the 6th of June. It would do considerably more damage months later, during the invasion of southern France that August, once German engineers had adjusted their planting to account for exactly what they had missed the first time. Building that obstacle belt was itself a small industrial undertaking. Rommel diverted forced labor, requisitioned local timber, and pulled entire units away from beach defense work to plant poles across the Norman interior through the winter and spring of 1944, an effort large enough that Allied photo reconnaissance flights tracked its spread across successive sorties and reported it up the chain to Leigh-Mallory in the first place. The poles varied field to field, some standing bare, some wired together in rows, a smaller number rigged with a mine or a grenade set to detonate against anything that struck them hard enough. Engineers attached to the airborne divisions trained specifically to clear or mark safe lanes through this kind of obstacle once on the ground. And gliders that did strike a pole on landing more often lost a wingtip or an undercarriage leg than the whole airframe, survivable in a great many cases. Precisely because a glider, unlike a powered aircraft, was already coming down at a relatively low, controlled speed by the time it reached the ground. Part 6. None of that meant the missions that followed were safe, only that the specific catastrophe everyone had braced for did not arrive in quite the form expected. 6 separate American glider missions flew into Normandy across barely 30 hours, from the early hours of the 6th of June through the morning of the 7th. Mission Chicago, carrying reinforcements and heavy equipment to the 101st Airborne, and Mission Detroit, carrying the equivalent load to the 82nd Airborne, went in together around 4 in the morning on the 6th, 52 gliders each. Chicago alone put 155 men, a bulldozer, 16 anti-tank guns, and roughly 11 tons of equipment onto Landing Zone E, and it was Chicago's lead serial that carried the Fighting Falcon and General Pratt. Mission Keokuk followed that evening, 32 tow planes bringing gliders into Landing Zone E, while scattered German troops were still active near the field. Mission Elmira followed a short time later, the largest single American glider operation flown that day, 176 C-47s, towing 36 American Wacos and 140 British-built Horsa gliders onto Landing Zone W. Elmira alone cost 15 glider pilots killed, 17 wounded, and 4 missing, along with 33 passengers killed and 124 wounded. Casualties drawn not from any single dramatic burst of anti-aircraft fire, but from the same accumulation of small, unglamorous hazards that had already killed Lieutenant Butler and General Pratt that morning. Hedgerows, poor visibility, and heavily loaded aircraft coming down too fast or too short on fields never built to receive them. 2 further missions, Galveston and Hackensack, flew into the 82nd Airborne Sector on the morning of the 7th, delivering the last of the division's glider-borne artillery and support troops, under noticeably lighter opposition than the missions that had gone in the day before. A reminder that even within this single operation, the level of danger varied enormously from one serial to the next, depending on timing, weather, and which particular field a given glider happened to be assigned. The equipment those first missions delivered was not symbolic. The bulldozer put down with Mission Chicago went to work almost immediately clearing wrecked gliders and obstacles off the landing zone so that later serials would have room to come in behind it, and the anti-tank guns brought in with Chicago and Detroit were pushed into position to help blunt the German armored counterattacks that Allied planners fully expected against the narrow beach exits behind Utah, the same exits the entire seaborne landing depended on staying open. Whatever the glider missions cost in dead and wounded pilots, the material they physically put on the ground in those first hours was judged by the officers actually fighting the battle around Sainte-Mère-Église and Sainte-Marie-du-Mont in the days that followed, to have been worth the cost of delivering it this way, rather than waiting for it to come ashore on the beach itself, days later, behind everything else competing for space on the same landing craft. Part 7. The honest shape of this story sits somewhere between the disaster Lee Mallory predicted and the clean heroism the word airborne usually implies in retrospect. The 70% casualty rate he feared across the whole force did not happen, and the pole obstacles that were supposed to cause much of it were, for the most part, planted in the wrong pastures on the day that mattered most. But the men flying these aircraft still went in with nothing to shoot back with, no way to abort a bad approach once committed, and no guarantee that the specific field waiting for them in the dark had been cut recently enough, or was dry enough, to let their brakes do the one job that mattered most. General Pratt did not die because the defense Rommel spent a year building actually worked as intended. He died because a wet lawn and an ordinary line of trees were enough, on their own, without a single German soldier firing at his particular aircraft, to end his life in the first minutes of the invasion. Sources do not fully agree on how many American glider pilots were killed or wounded across the full run of D-Day missions, and this channel would rather say so than quote a single precise total as settled fact. Official after-action tallies compiled in the days after the invasion, veterans' own post-war accounts, and later historical reconstructions all arrive at somewhat different figures, a genuine consequence of how chaotic the accounting was in the days immediately following the landings, when men from a dozen different serials were scattered across a battlefield still being fought over, some killed outright, some missing and later found alive, some wounded seriously enough to be evacuated before anyone in their own unit could confirm what had happened to them. What is not in serious dispute is the shape of the danger itself. That the worst single hazards facing these pilots were not the pole obstacles Lee Mallory named in his warning to Eisenhower, but the ordinary terrain of Normandy itself, wet fields, hedgerows, and the simple, unforgiving arithmetic of landing a heavy, unpowered aircraft on unfamiliar ground in the dark. What happened to a glider pilot after he landed was, if anything, even less settled than what happened to him getting there. Having no organic combat role of his own once on the ground, no armored vehicle, no standing unit structure beyond his fellow pilots, a glider pilot was generally expected simply to pick up whatever weapon he could find at the crash site and fight as a rifleman alongside the airborne troops he had just delivered. An infantry assignment nobody had specifically trained him for, sitting awkwardly alongside a rank, flight officer, that had been invented mainly to solve a personnel administration problem rather than a combat one. Some pilots fought for days before being pulled back to England to fly the next mission. The Army eventually built a doctrine around gathering scattered glider pilots into makeshift units to guard command posts and prisoners, a task that suited men who had received almost no infantry training, but now found themselves, briefly, indistinguishable from the paratroopers around them. Lieutenant John Butler did not live to see any of what came after. He was buried among the men of the invasion he had helped deliver, one name among the thousands the Normandy American Cemetery now holds above Omaha Beach. Mike Murphy, both legs broken in the crash that killed his co-pilot and his passenger, recovered from his injuries and was awarded the Legion of Merit, the Bronze Star, and the Purple Heart. Before the war, he had been a barnstorming stunt pilot, known on the pre-war airshow circuit as the Flying Irishman, a two-time world aerobatics champion, and, by his own considerable reputation, the first pilot ever to take off from and land on top of a moving automobile. He went on to a long post-war career and died quietly in Northwest Ohio in April 1981 at the age of 74, 37 years after the crash that had nearly killed him on the far side of a French hedgerow. Brigadier General Don Pratt was buried initially in Normandy and later reinterred at Arlington National Cemetery. A memorial today stands near the field outside Highsville where the Fighting Falcon came down. And the Jeep he rode in, recovered from the wreckage, is preserved at the 101st Airborne's Museum at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. Recognition for what these men had done came slowly and, by most participants' own accounts, incompletely. Glider pilots argued for years after the war that their combat role, flying into contested airspace with no weapon and no armor, and then fighting on the ground once they landed, had never been properly compensated or honored alongside the flight and combat pay routinely given to bomber and fighter crews. And veterans of the program eventually organized their own association specifically to preserve a history that the Army itself had been slow to record. The National World War II Glider Pilots Association pushed for decades to have the program's contribution formally acknowledged, and it was largely through their own effort, not an official Army history written at the time, that the phrase "silent wings" survived at all, attached eventually to both a book and the museum built in their memory in Terrell, Texas. The wider glider pilot program did not long outlive the war that had created it. Once helicopters demonstrated they could deliver troops and equipment with an engine, a return flight, and no need to gamble everything on a single unpowered landing in an unfamiliar field, the entire concept the CG-4A represented became obsolete within a very few years, and the roughly 6,000 men who had trained to fly it faded out of the Army Air Force's structure almost as quickly as they had entered it, with little of the institutional memory or public recognition given to the fighter and bomber crews who flew alongside them. Their story took decades to reach a wider audience, eventually gathered by veterans of the program themselves under the title Silent Wings, a name that would in time also mark a dedicated museum in Terrell, Texas, near one of their old training fields. And that remains a fitting description for men who flew into the most heavily defended stretch of coastline in the world, with no engine to announce their approach and no gun to answer with once they arrived. Subscribe if you want the next chapter, because there are more of these. More ordinary volunteers handed the least forgiving job in someone else's war plan. More machines built to be flown exactly once. More men whose courage was measured not in kills or medals, but in simply agreeing to sit still inside an unarmed aircraft, while somebody else, from the ground, decided whether the field below was safe enough to land on. The Fighting Falcon reached its landing zone exactly on target. The grass was wet. That was enough.